Hello and welcome to Identiterati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 136. Quick reminder, please follow the live stream on LinkedIn. That really helps support us. Our guest today is Andi Hindle, Identiterati at Large. Welcome, Andi.
Hey, Mike. You did warn me you were going to use that title, and here I am laughing again, even though I knew you were going to do it. Yeah, I'm delighted to be on. Thank you for having me.
So before we dive into our topic today, just tell us a little bit about how you got here. You have a long, illustrious career, like just a quick overview for people who don't know you.
I'm making notes now. My career was illustrious. I'll put that in my resume next time around. Thank you. Yeah, so okay, let's start with the very early days. These are some of the things that people don't necessarily know. So I did not start out in technology. I actually have a degree in Japanese. So I was a linguist, kind of coming through school and through university. I fell into the software industry as I came out of university because there was a job in the software industry, and that seemed like a good thing to have when I was 24, 25. I then fell into identity, and I know a lot of people, and I know you do, Mike, as well, who didn't necessarily start out in identity, and then they fell into this big identity bucket, and they started swimming around, and they're like, "Oh, this is fun," and then they stayed there. So I'm one of those. Fell into identity entirely by accident when I joined Ping Identity, and that's a long time ago now. This is when Ping was still tiny, small startup company. I was with Ping in a essentially business development role, for want of a better description, for about 7 years. Left there at the end of 2013, so that gives you some sense of how long ago it was. And then was asked to pick up looking after what was then Cloud Identity Summit, which obviously Andre Durand at Ping had started. Initially, just to pick up the sort of content and make sure that was happening and okay, effectively taking over from our mutual friend and colleague Mark Diodati. And then that first year kind of went okay, and so they asked me, okay, well, would you carry on doing that? Which I did. Alongside of that, though, I have been, ever since I left Ping, consulting independently, mostly in the digital identity and subsequently in the privacy and corporate governance space. And so today I am increasingly broad and shallow, right? I'm involved in all sorts of different bits and pieces, both within the industry and a little bit around the edges of the industry. And that keeps me busy and out of trouble, which is great.
You reminded me that Mark Diodati was the content, I guess, organizer before. I had completely forgot that there was a content moderator before you.
Yep. Yeah, that was Mark, and he really set up a lot of the initial, kind of principles by which the content operated. We made some changes over the years, but some of the fundamentals are still absolutely true. And those are some of the things that we haven't changed since the very beginning. So, right. It's a lot bigger than it was. We cover a lot more topics than it did when it was
true.
In a room in Keystone. And we have a much bigger audience, but it's some of those fundamentals are still true, right? The way that he managed the content to make sure that it is. I always struggle with this a little bit because we're not it's not peer review. It's not an academic conference in that sense. Mm-hmm. It is about as close to it. And you've been through this process several times, right? As a presenter, it's about as close to it as you're going to get without going to that extent. And that's been a really important kind of cornerstone for us over the years.
Yeah. So actually, the topic today is Identiterati, because a decade at Identiterati, your role is changing somehow. We'll hear about that, I'm sure, sometime in the future. So the first, now this was Cloud Identity Summit, as you mentioned before. And which was the first one that you actually, was it the one in Vail? Or which one?
So Cloud Identity Summit ran, I want to say, now I'm doing this. This is where I need my magic slide that actually has the dates on it. So you're gonna watch me do this in real time and try and figure out exactly what happened when, right? So the first few were all Cloud Identity Summit. So Keystone twice, Vail, Napa, Monterey, San Diego, so Torrey Pines. Those were all Cloud Identity Summit. Then we landed in New Orleans,
Yeah, I remember that.
which was
Yeah.
an amazing event that particular year. And that was the first time that we started to make some really big changes to what was happening. So we added a lot of security content that year. The agenda got a lot bigger that year, and that was what prompted us. In fact, I remember a lady came up to me. I was drifting around the expo hall, and she came up. She said, "Oh, this is a great event. I wish I'd have known that you covered more than just cloud identity." And we're like, "Yeah, we probably need to rebrand." Right? So we announced the rebranding the following year in Chicago. We announced that we were going to rebrand it from Cloud Identity Summit to Identiverse. And then in Washington, D.C., from memory, I think was the first year that we actually formally were branded.
Right.
Oh, Boston. Sorry, it was Boston after Chicago.
Yeah, I couldn't remember a DC one actually, but I was like, I haven't been to everyone, so it's like, oh, that must have been one I didn't go to.
Yeah.
So before the Identiverse, and I remember getting some piece of swag as I walked out of a keynote after Andre announced that. I forget what they gave out, some random piece of swag. What did you think about the new name when they finally settled on it?
So, little insider story about the name. We had, several of us batting some ideas around, and Identiverse actually was a brand and name which Ping Identity already owned. They already had. They'd run a project internally that had come up with that name for something. And they hadn't particularly used it, maybe briefly for a marketing campaign. And I'm doing that from memory, so my apologies to those involved if I got some of the detail wrong, but that's my recollection. And I remembered it because I had been at Ping at that time, right? So I obviously subsequently left. I'm now involved in Cloud Identity Summit on a consulting basis. But I remembered that they had this brand, and I'm like, wouldn't that be a great name? And I want to say it was the CMO at the time who had not been around for when that name had originally been developed. He said, "Well, what do you mean we own it?" I'm like, literally walked in the office. I want to say it was in the San Francisco office at the time. I literally walked into the kitchen. They've got a whole bunch of mugs that are branded Identiverse that they already had the original thing. I'm like, you own this. It's like, yeah, that would be a good name. I'm like, okay. So that's where it came from. And I think it was a very good, I was very pleased when we realized that we could use it, because again, it's sort of an echo of what that lady had originally, said to me. Oh, you do so much more than just cloud identity. And what we've seen over the years is that more and more things get wrapped up, and you find that the fundamental, driving force behind an awful lot of stuff online is actually the identity, substrate. Right now, you and I know that, and we've been talking about that for a long time, but lots of people haven't realized it. Lots of people still haven't realized it. And so it really gave us license to start to talk about not just everything that was happening in the identity industry, but also some of the things that are happening around the edges that are relevant to us and to which we are relevant. So things like the whole privacy and ethics conversation, things like the AI and machine learning conversation, right? Where those are spaces that we need to get involved in, and they're spaces that have an impact on us. And so, if we were still Cloud Identity Summit, it would be hard to have some of those conversations. But as Identiverse, it's much easier, right? And it's also much easier for the vendors in the space to come and get involved as well, right? So I like it.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask a bit of a nostalgia question. So this is safe territory because I'm just asking about Cloud Identity Summit, like forgetting Identiverse, but what was your favorite Cloud Identity Summit venue?
Oh, wow. Now that is a question. So my I am very fond of New Orleans as a place. I always have been. I'm a big jazz and blues fan, and that particular year was we had so much fun with it, right? I mean, I can't remember. I think you were there.
I was
But we did the whole parade at the end with the band and everything. It was fantastic. So that one really sticks in my memory. And then I would say probably the very early ones up in Keystone, but for very different reasons, right? I was less aware at that time of everything that was going on in the industry. I wasn't as sort of plugged into stuff as I am now. But I do remember having a whale of a time up in the mountains in places where I wouldn't ordinarily get to go. Right? I mean, I'm those who don't know, I'm based in the UK, and so my trips to the US tend to be fairly business focused, and therefore they tend to be to places where the business is happening. And that doesn't usually include places like, Vail and Keystone and, a lovely winery in Napa and Monterey, right? So those ones I remember for different reasons. But yeah, New Orleans is the one that really, really sticks in my mind.
okay. I'm going to venture just a comment here myself and vote. I'm voting for Val.
Okay.
So Andre does a really amazing job on all those conferences, and I understand Andre's wife was involved even in that Vail event too. So they really went all out, and the events were amazing. And Vail, my kids still talk about this event.
Yeah.
They had all sorts of stuff there. They had a guy who made flip books. They had we went up to the top of the mountain up on and I don't even get to go to these places very much. I might live in Austin, but I don't actually drive 3 hours out to Vail very much myself.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
pretty spectacular location, Colorado. Yeah, I'm thinking of moving to Colorado, so we're not definite, but Colorado has a lot of amazing outdoor stuff, as you know. So it's a pretty special place, and they have so many. Each area of Colorado has so many special places. So lots of ecosystems. You just drive a couple of miles, and you're in a different ecosystem.
Right. Yeah. No, that's awesome. And you're right. I mean, forgotten. I hadn't thought for a long time about the family program. And you're right. It was Andre and Andre's wife who put that together. Pretty much on the spur of the moment, right? When we realized that they realized that there were a bunch of folks coming up and spending the weekend with families. And so let's have something for them to do. And that ran for a long time. It was only when we got to a scale where it was just hard to do, safely and effectively, that it was one of those things that eventually you outgrow. And whilst it's always sad when that happens, it's also the right thing to do for the event, right? Things change, but yeah, that was a lot of fun.
So you mentioned that the scope of the conference has expanded from initially from its origins. What's the area that we're going into that's most surprising to you?
Oh, that's a great question. He's like stopped me in my tracks. As anyone who's watching this who knows me is like, wait a minute, that doesn't happen very often. I'm like, oh, good question. So I think the thing that surprised me, I guess, this year in particular, and in all honesty, maybe it was because I wasn't paying attention, right? The sudden explosion of machine identity as a huge driver in the industry and something that a lot of people are concerned about. That one took me by surprise a little bit. AI less so. I mean, in one sense, everyone was surprised about AI because it happened very quickly, but it's not particularly surprising that we're spending time talking about it. But I think the scale and scope of the machine identity stuff, to me, felt like it was very sudden and very surprising. I don't know how long that will last, right? Like, I think maybe some of the answers to some of those questions are relatively straightforward and we can deal with it fairly promptly. So at a technical level, I think it was probably that, and like I say, it was maybe because it's not an area that I've particularly, been watching, and so it sort of happened, and I didn't expect to see it. On a non-technical level, I think the number of conversations that professionals are having about how to be a professional in the industry, right? So this isn't about, how do I deal with delegation chains? It isn't about, do we need to get some identity in the whole MCP flow for, AI? It's not those kinds of conversations. It's how do I get budget for my project? How do I convince management that we need, more staff? How do I, think about identity at a senior executive level when I've got 101 other things to think about? Should identity be its own, should it have its own C-level? We've had that conversation before, right? And it's interesting to me that those conversations, which frankly started, a few years ago, are increasingly prevalent, right? It doesn't feel like we've gotten very close to solving any of them. Maybe that's because they are not necessarily solvable, right? These are ongoing questions that professionals in the industry are asking and will continue to ask because we'll keep having, new folks coming into the industry. But that's interesting. I didn't expect that would happen, right? I always thought, yeah, we'll keep talking about the technical problems and maybe we'll start to talk about some of the business problems, but the professional development side of things, which I find fascinating, and I'm very glad that we have a space where people can have those conversations, hopefully productively. That one surprised me.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And yeah, to me, the professional development seems like a cultural issue. Like in the beginning, this was sort of like a very, sort of startup-y small division within a company. But now this is infrastructure that's going to be in place for a long time. And there's a culture, and culture evolves slowly. You can't
Mhm.
really rush it. And so it seems like we're at this point in the industry where our industry is matured, and a culture is evolving, and whether there's a chief identity officer in the future or other stuff is cultural. That is really interesting observation. Um, and let's pivot to the machine one, because it's that raises a really existential question for Identiverse.
Mhm.
The idea of Identiverse was probably person identity, right? The identity in the Identiverse, probably we were thinking about people. Um, and it sounds to me like what you're saying is maybe that that now there's more software identities than person identities, and so identity is sort of maybe broadened its definition, which really fundamentally changes what we're talking about. Um,
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree with the assertion that yes, identity is now a lot more than just, join a mover lever and customer, right? It's process, it's software, it's agent, it's machine, it's all of those things. And I think that's probably been true for a little while. Um, but it's more true. Can you say more true? It is more the case now than it was before, right? Um, what's interesting is that not all, but a lot of the underlying constructs are still the same things that we've been doing for a long time, right? I mean, you think about API security, that's OAuth, right? And we think about OAuth in terms of how do you get my identity and insert it into an API flow, but there are lots of developers who come at it, from I'm just building an API. They don't come at it from a person perspective at all. They're just building a piece of software that happens to have some ways in, and they need to get a piece of data as they do that happens to be about a person. Well, increasingly, it's not necessarily about a person, or it's not just about a person. It's about some other things as well, but the fundamental constructs are the same. Yes, there are some new standards, Spiffy and Whimsy and those things, but it's interesting. I think the reason that it really grabs people's attention at this point, more than anything else, is scale. Speed and scale, right? Or scale both in terms of numbers and pace. There's many more, there are many more API to API calls than there are people clicking on things, with the result that you have to deal with a highly mutable environment and an extreme velocity in that environment. And that isn't necessarily something that if you think about, kind of traditional person-based identity, you necessarily think of, except in very large scale deployments. And so that has implications for how we think about things. But yeah, it's, back to your earlier question. It's nice that we don't have to rename the conference just so we can talk about that stuff.
Yeah. I want to dig a little bit maybe into the trust layer. A lot of the fundamental question about Identiverse was really not about how do we authenticate people, although that's always been a theme, but how do we trust, in this new B2B environment, we're calling other agents, we're calling APIs, we're using software on our phone, and the real challenge for the business is how can we trust this data, or how can we trust opening this capability of our firm to you? How do you think we've evolved over the last 10 years in that area? Have we gone forwards, backwards, or nowhere?
I'm going to say some contentious things now that people aren't necessarily going to agree with. Let's start with some things that haven't changed. So when I originally joined, so back to my, what is my history thing at the top here. When I originally joined Ping, Ping's primary product was effectively a SAML server, right? And one of the questions that came up in pretty much every sales conversation was, well, we need some kind of special agreement if we're going to have an identity federation between company A and company B, right? We need to have some special document that legal have agreed to. And so pretty much everyone that was operating in that space at that time came up with these sort of blueprint federation agreement documents that some lawyer had drawn up that were like templates that you could take to a customer and say, well, here's the federation. And that started to get very difficult and time consuming, and it really slowed things down until collectively, I think we all realized, and when I say all, I mean everyone who was in the industry and a lot of the early customers as well. They're like, wait a minute, if company A and company B are already doing business, there's probably already a contract between them that probably says some stuff about it's okay for us to share data. Should we go and find out? Oh yes, look, we already have one of these. We don't need to do anything special. So the first way in which I think things have not changed is that question about do we need a special agreement still comes up in very different contexts. And 9 times out of 10, the answer is exactly the same as it used to be. You probably already have some, customer agreement or business agreement that's in place, or that you get customers to agree to, that has this stuff in it, right? And that hasn't changed, which is good. Another thing that hasn't changed is that there are, and I'm now telling people listening to this stuff that they know perfectly well, right? We all know at a technical level how trust is established, right? And so that I think is of essentially no concern. Where I'm going to start to say things that people may not agree with is there is an interesting reaction that we've seen over, I'll say, the last 3 to 4 years, where in response to fears, particularly in the consumer space around how do I know that, Joe who's just turned up at my website claiming to be Joe actually is Joe. The response to that has been, oh, I know, we'll deploy some kind of identity proofing. And this has blown up again over the course of the summer in a number of places, yes, in the UK, but I know also in the US and a number of other places too, where, age verification has started to get rolled out for various things. And there's been some very interesting choices have been made by some companies in the space about how they want to go about doing this. And in some cases, I look at it and I go, okay, maybe you were rushing a little bit. You didn't maybe get the best advice. This is fixed. In other cases, I look at it and I go, it feels to me like you may have chosen to do something badly because you wanted to make a point. I'm really, really concerned about this notion that everything has to be a trusted interaction. And in order for that to be the case, I have to know everything about you. That is not true. And the more we go down a path of saying, I have to do that, the less reliable that information is going to be. And we already saw this happen with KBA, right? So knowledge-based authentication, which is now essentially dead, because there have been so many data breaches that the data is freely available that everybody knows the knowledge, at which point I can't authenticate an individual with it, right? It's a non-thing. Well, imagine we do that with things like passport details and other, quasi-official documents that really do prove that you are who you claim to be. If that whole process gets broken, it's not at all clear to me what we do for those use cases where trust really matters, where that knowledge really matters. So that's the bit that I'm concerned about, which I think is changing. I think it's changing very rapidly, and I think it's changing in many cases in some very bad and dangerous ways.
I'm going to push back a little bit on your contention. And so I'd say for access, you're right. Like, can I get into this website? And it's probably okay. But when there's data involved, when it's one company sharing data with another company, or me sharing my data with an organization, I think there still are trust issues. And I also feel like the ability of people to trust AI agents to act, to do stuff. Like, I don't think anyone's crazy enough to let ChatGPT even book dinner for them yet. Maybe that's half functionality, but people also talk about, I think, trust issues about how are we going to establish, trust that you'll respect I'm going to share data with you, but that data comes with certain obligations and restrictions. Right. And so I feel like there's no collective bargaining power on the part of in the B2B space or in the consumer space. And I feel like nobody really wants to talk about this.
Yeah. That's actually a really good point, Mike. And you're reminding me, I'm going back quite a long way now, of the VRM stuff, right? The vendor relationship management stuff that DocSells was a big proponent of. And I know that Eve Mailer had some tie in there as well in the early days. Yeah, I think that's a very fair comment. And I don't know that there's an immediately obvious solution, except that I do think to some extent that speaks in support of the, let's not encourage people to share more than they actually have to for a given use case. You don't need to know where I live necessarily, or how many dogs and cats I have, if all I want to do is buy a shirt from your online store, right? You need to know that I can pay you. That's pretty much it. So I think I share some of those concerns, Mike, but it's very easy, and we've gotten into this habit of both individually oversharing and as organizations assuming that it's okay to ask for and collect and store a whole bunch of information that we don't necessarily need. And whilst I think, in some jurisdictions, regulations have helped with that, and certainly they've helped organizations think about things in ways that maybe they hadn't thought about before, to think about the risks of holding that information, to think about the overhead of holding that information. I'm also not entirely convinced that regulation is always the answer to everything. Right? I think it helps, but it's not the fundamental answer. So there are some tricky questions there, and it'll be interesting to see how things play out.
I'll give you another example with a little bit of self-confession here. So the UK introduced a new visa fee for Americans. I have to contribute to keeping the lights running, which I'm perfectly okay with.
My life is working great. Thank you. I appreciate your help.
So I had no problem with the fee, but I was maybe not diligent enough in finding out the right website to go to. So when I searched UK ETA visa or whatever, a website came out, etavisa.co.uk, and I went there and I paid them and I uploaded a picture of my passport and I realized it was not the UK government. And so in the interest of maybe, and by the way, they totally matched the process. Like I got the same email verification. So I wouldn't have even known that if there wasn't a price discrepancy, I might not have known that I'd been phished. And I like to think I'm a more than at least an average, average intelligence, consumer. And it happened to me. So phishing is really rampant. It's almost the point of attack of every breach. The root cause is like a phishing email of some kind. And so, and this is, even used by state level actors, phishing. So it's like, it works so well. It's not just consumers who are getting phished, really governments are getting phished, banks are getting phished. And so, I don't know. I think that this lack of trust is really more challenging than we give it credit for.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and it's a fair point. I don't. I wish I had an answer, and I really don't. It has often struck me. So I use LinkedIn a fair amount, but I've been using it for a very long time, and it's actually still the case. If you go and read the kind of how should I use LinkedIn pages, right? Pretty much says you should connect with people that you've actually met, right? And I do that, right? I will not connect with people on LinkedIn that I haven't had a personal, actual, face-to-face, in real life conversation with. And I speak to people who don't use LinkedIn that way, and I think to myself, but the whole point is that you actually know who those people are. But of course, the reality is that the world doesn't necessarily look the way that I think it looks to other people, right? And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, especially when you start to think about deep fakes. I mean, it's very challenging, and it's challenging not just from a technical standpoint. It's challenging from a human standpoint because we don't think about things that way. I mean, I remember sort of a similar situation to this. It's years ago now, but I was talking with somebody about young children and keeping kids, safe online, basically. And she was a child psychologist, and she made this. I wish I could remember her name, but I can't. But she had this really interesting observation, which is that, fundamentally we are apes, right? And one of the things that most animals do is that they operate differently when they're in a safe environment versus when they're in an environment that is unfamiliar to them, right? And so this manifests for us. I travel a lot, and invariably my first night in an unfamiliar hotel is awful. And I always thought that was just me. Well, A, it turns out it's not just me, and B, it turns out that there's actually a reason for that, which is that effectively the little 8-bit of your brain is going, this is an unfamiliar environment. I need to be on higher alert, right? And so you are more likely to rouse at unfamiliar noises and weird lights and whatever, because your brain is operating at a higher perceived level of risk. So this is how we operate as humans, right? We are, I mean, there's a statistic somewhere out there about the number of car accidents that happen, within 5 miles of the home, right? Because you relax, you're in a more familiar environment, you're paying less attention to risk. And so this is what happens when we're using computers at home. This feels like a safe environment, but it's not.
Right.
And so and I wish somebody, I mean, this feels like a wonderful PhD study for somebody to go and do, right? Is am I more likely to click on a phishing email if I'm in my home office or, on a business trip in an
In a
airport
cyber
lounge?
cafe. Yeah.
That would be a fascinating question to answer. And my hypothesis would be, I bet that we are more likely to click on that email if we are in this physically safe environment, right? But increasingly we're online and it's not a safe environment, right? It's not a familiar environment, but our brains don't tell us that. I don't know what the answer to any of that is, but they are difficult problems. And I don't, whilst I absolutely believe that identity is a significant, like the identity industry has a lot of the pieces here, I don't think we have all of them. And so it's good, I think, that we're starting to see a number of groups now, in some of the working groups and various things. The one that springs to mind is the work that Dean Sachs and Eve Mailer and others are doing in the Death and the Digital Estate group, right? And starting to engage with folks very much from outside of the industry, right? Lawyers and ethicists and others. And that's not new, right? We have done that over time, but I think there's more of it happening. And it's so important because fundamentally identity is the thing that enables all this stuff to work okay, but there's a bunch of stuff that we don't understand that's outside of the technical sphere even, that we kind of need to get our heads around over the next 5 to 10 years.
So you mentioned Eve, and it reminded me that we were on the UMA working group together, and UMA never really got a critical mass of adoption. However, it addressed sort of a requirement out there that I'm not sure has ever been addressed. And now we're seeing, UMA was Alice to Bob sharing, and now we're seeing what Eve jokes is Alice to bot sharing. I want to basically give consent to authorize, maybe instead of Bob, but maybe this AI agent to do something on my behalf. And now I'm seeing specs at the drafts at the IETF around on behalf of. So I'm just curious if you could put your Umatarian hat on for a second, and with a couple of years of perspective on this, maybe just comment on, do we need to bring Uma back? Maybe.
So I have a soft spot for Uma, as those who know me will know, and I use every possible opportunity that comes up to talk about it. And I do think I'm glad you bring it up. Actually, I do think that at minimum, a lot of the thinking that went into the UMA specification, right? The use cases, the authorization flows, the things that we think of as edge cases, and then you go into a particular industry and it turns out that the edge case is actually the use case. Healthcare in particular is the one that springs to mind. That thinking, which informed the UMA work and the 2 specifications that came out of it, I think is still extremely informative. And I know that some of the new working groups that have emerged have at least gone back and looked at some of that. Most of it's public through Kantara on on the wiki there. Whether the specifications themselves are, like should we run around and encourage large enterprise to start deploying UMA today? I mean, okay, there's a part of me that says yes, we should, but
And the glue
that's because
server
I have a soft
supports it,
spot.
by the way. So does
Right.
WSO2 and Keycloak and everything except Ping, I think. Yeah. But no, ForgeRock does, of course, in the Ping suite.
Right. But I think even if that's not the right answer, and I don't propose to pretend to know, but I do think that the fundamentals are really valid, and so anything that we do decide, I think could learn an awful lot from some of that thinking, and it would be sensible to do that, right? I mean, it makes no sense to reinvent all that stuff. The use cases are complicated, right? I mean, I talked about this a little bit at my keynote at Identiverse this year, that even the relatively straightforward delegation use case is one that we still struggle with to some degree. And what we're now seeing are these what I call delegation chains, and I'm sure that somebody else used that term before I did. But I want to authorize my agent to do something on my behalf, at which point it's going to call some other API somewhere within an organization that's going to do something on my behalf, right? And you put that in a financial services context. Well, now somebody else probably has to authorize that, at which point we've got two agents acting. Yeah.
How do you track that as it goes through the workflow of various?
Right.
Yeah.
How do you track it? How do you store that so that if something went wrong, you can go back and find out and fix it, right? How do you audit it? How do you protect it? Those are big questions, and they are coming up very, very quickly. And so, there's a little part of me that's frustrated because I think, Eve and others, the other folks that were involved on the UMA working group, to say we foresaw this would be overstating it, but these were exactly the kinds of problems that we were talking about, likely folks having to solve, and here we are.
There was some pattern matching with the human use cases, although the scale is different. There was some pattern matching there with the use case.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the good news here is that there is a body of work which is really valuable, which at the very least will accelerate this next wave of innovation, which is a good thing.
I'm going to take the bait a little bit and go off script and talk about, you mentioned digital death, and I was trying to avoid the topic, but I just want to say a word about this. My wife made a podcast about end-of-life autonomy. It's called Kicking the Bucket. So I've been hearing a lot of sort of experts in sort of end-of-life stuff. And one thing that they do is that they use the term advanced directive. And I think that there's some overlap between the need to authorize something even after you're dead. Something that you can present, let's say an advanced directive. People tend to think of like power of attorney, but power of attorney is very broad, right? It's this person's going to process and make decisions, but an advanced directive is like, for this specific use case, this person is delegated as my advocate. And I feel like there's a parallel to be made here, where when you try to do something and we say, no, you're not authorized to do that. In OpenID, there's a mechanism where we use the code, we return the code, or you could return, let's say, a pre-authentication session ID. So I think UMA, the way it introduces the idea of this ticket, the ticket is almost like an advanced directive in creation. And it's going to traverse various steps, and maybe it will become a fully executed advanced directive at some point. But I feel like there is some overlap here in these ideas.
That's really interesting, and it reminds me too of, we spoke about then, and I know this has come up again more recently, right? That the intersection between these things and constructs like the consent receipt, as a mechanism of creating something that in relatively human readable format memorializes those decisions that get made at a particular point in time, right? And they, I mean, you're right. There's lots of interesting existing work, which, like I said before, right, at minimum informs, and in some cases may very well provide a pre-constructed answer to how do we solve for some of this. They're difficult questions, and they're difficult not just at a technical level. They're difficult for all sorts of reasons. And I'm glad that we're in a position to, as an industry, to start to think about those things.
The birds are warning us that we're over time a little bit, which I apologize for. Any last thoughts before we break?
Yeah, I actually think that last question kind of wrapped things up really nicely, right? I think for me, the industry feels like it's at a really interesting moment of growth. And I think for professionals in the space, that's really exciting because there's a lot more to think about. There's a lot more areas to get into. That has all sorts of implications for career development, which is, always a good thing. I think it's very exciting for vendors, for entrepreneurs, for technologists in the space. There are interesting problems to think about, interesting problems to solve. There are also a bunch of risks, and I think they are, in some cases, quite material risks. If we get some of these things wrong this time around, it's going to be hard to fix them again later. That may mean, taking things a little bit more slowly than we might want. And particularly when the world feels like it's going, at 100 miles an hour, being the person that turns around and goes, yeah, could we just tap the brakes a little bit? But sometimes we're going to have to do that. There's a lot to get excited about, and I think that, I guess that's my closing thought, right? Is if you're in the space, looking at all of the adjacencies as well as just what's going on, is interesting and fascinating and useful and helpful, and I can't wait to see what happens next.
Okay, awesome. Well, I just want to quickly announce the next episode. We have the iPhone, we have iCloud, and now we have iOPA, because Apple has acquired Styra, the company behind Open Policy Agent, or OPA. So going a little overboard on the Apple puns, the next episode is iOPA. Styra gets a Genius Bar makeover. And Or Weiss, the founder of Permit.io, and I are gonna rampantly speculate about things that we have no idea about, which is, we know why Styra sold, but why did Apple buy this thing? Like, what's their plan? Why is authorization so important to them? Where could this go? So that's next Thursday. Thank you, Andi, so much for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure and an honor. So thank you so much for joining.